questions that you guys posted in the discussion section for Chapter 12. So our first question has to do with altruism and how we define altruism. And so the question was that you had learned in ecology that there was a debate whether altruism should actually exist. And I think the confusing part here is how we choose to define altruism. Altruism, by definition, is really looking at those situations where an individual does something for another individual at its own expense. Okay, so it would lower its fitness and increase the fitness of other individuals. And what they're saying, that kind of altruism probably shouldn't really exist in any big way, if at all, because genes that would cause you to be altruistic in such a way would actually decrease their frequency in the population, because by definition, if you lower your fitness, you're not getting as many genes out there. So if there's an altruistic gene and it's actually undermining itself because it's not getting into the next generation, that gene shouldn't really exist. However, then we sometimes say, well, we see what is apparent altruism in the wild. So if we look at it and we see an individual doing something that appears to be helping another individual and appears to be hurting it, what might be happening is we just don't have enough of the real information. So it may be that it's not, it's helping this other individual and it's really not taking on a big cost to itself. So maybe it really isn't influencing its own fitness. The other possibility could be that it's helping individuals that are related to it. And if it's helping related individuals, then again, it's not necessarily decreasing its own fitness because it receives fitness from those relatives. So if you're helping relatives, then technically it's not really altruism because you are not decreasing your own fitness. Another possibility is that you could have a reciprocity situation. So it might look like you're decreasing your own fitness by helping this other individual, but then at some other time, this other individual will actually help you. So if you were to sum sort of all those interactions over a long time period, it may well be that by helping other individuals, you receive help yourself, and overall your fitness is actually higher. So if we're just going to go by altruism, technically being a lowering of fitness, it may not actually exist in that true definition of the sense. Now in this particular case, what they're also talking about is something a little bit different, in that if you can actually imagine getting a group of altruistic individuals that because they're altruistic, that group does better than other groups that are not behaving altruistically. So even though let's say you might have a slightly lower fitness by being a member of this group and helping, overall that group is going to do better. So again, I think it still would come back to, if you're part of an altruistic group and you're helping within that altruistic group, yeah, it might look like a selfish gene could do better there, but what you're finding is those altruistic groups are doing better, and then by definition they're also leaving more altruistic genes behind. So I think that possibly is one of the major differences that you're seeing between this and what you might have talked about in ecology. So again, does true altruism exist? Probably not, and we believe that it probably doesn't because of the fact that you have this caveat that true altruism must decrease your own individual fitness compared to others. There were two questions that came in about haplodiploidy, and so here on the left first. This is looking at an unfertilized egg that the female produces. So it's got, one copy of each type of chromosome, right? And so it's haploid, right? And in this particular case, this unfertilized haploid egg can become an individual, which is going to be a male. So females can produce sons by not fertilizing their eggs. So males are haploid. Females, on the other hand, are diploid. So if a female makes this egg, in order to produce a daughter, it has to fertilize that egg, and then this daughter is diploid. Okay? So if you look at it here, between a mom and her offspring, she's still essentially 50% related to her offspring. Now, if we come over here and we look at different situations, most of the females that are going to be in the hive are going to be sisters of one another, because for the most part they came from one mom, and we're going to assume right now that that mom only mated with one male. So there was a male and a female, they mated, and then they made a whole bunch of these daughters, right? And those daughters, of course, are sisters to one another. So what they are looking at here is saying, okay, so first off, if we just look at the female gametes and the male gametes, right? So these are all the different types of female gametes we can get, the different eggs we can get, and then this is the type of sperm we can get, and he's haploid, so that's all he can make. And so these are all the different female offspring that you can make, right? Because remember, the male offspring are just going to be these unfertilized eggs up here. So these are all the possible female offspring. So what they're doing is saying, okay, let's just look at two of them for right now. So we're going to compare B and C, or I'm sorry, C and A. So we're going to compare two of these individuals. And if we look here and we just count basically how many chromosomes do they share in common. So these first two actually have 3 chromosomes in common, right? The ones that they're highlighting here. So those 3 they share together. So these two individuals have 3 out of 4 chromosomes that are the same, so that's a 75% similarity. And then you also could look at it from the other perspective, and you could say, well, let's look at these two and then this one. So if I was to compare C and B, so these are, so we compared C and A. Now we'll compare C and B, and they also have 75%. So now we did C and B, 75%. Now if we compare an individual, if we just took one of the females out that happened to get this, and then another one that got the same thing, of course they're 100% related. So if I pick 2 of those, and now what happens if we compare C and D? So if we compare C and D, they're going to share 50% of their chromosomes. So on average, if we add all those up and then divide by 4, on average, sisters are 75% related to one another. Now remember, mom is only 50% related to her offspring, but sisters are 75% related to one another. So if we ask a question about why would a female forego her own reproduction to help her mom, who is the queen, raise offspring, this is one of the possible answers, is that she actually does better by helping mom raise offspring because she's on average 75% related to all of those female offspring. Not true of the male offspring. She's 50% related to those, but she's 75% related on average to her sisters, and she would have only been 50% average related to her own children. So in essence, she's actually doing better by helping produce siblings than she would if she produced her own offspring. This next question is kind of similar to that. Here you're asking, for eusocial species that undergo monogamy and polyandry, it's implied that polyandry increases genetic diversity, or just limits it. Okay, so here's the fundamental issue here. Remember what the previous question was just asking about that haplodiploidy. Okay, so if I go back there for a second, what we see is that we get this 75% relatedness only if we have a single male mating with a single female. So this 75% relatedness was contingent upon this female only mating with one male. If this female mated with lots of males and we had different chromosomes out here, this would not hold true. We wouldn't get that 75% relatedness. And so when we ask questions about what is the role of monogamy in the evolution of social behavior, they probably had to go together, because if you didn't have monogamy, you wouldn't get that high that 75% relatedness among the females. And so it's probably not the only condition that is needed to get the evolution of eusocial behavior. We see some organisms that are not haplodiploid that are social, and then we also see some haplodiploid organisms that are not social. So it probably helps the evolution of sociality, but it's not the only variable that can affect it, and it's not sort of a major prerequisite. So some animals can evolve social behavior without being haplodiploid, and then other haplodiploid are not social. But again, it definitely contributes to it because it increases that relatedness among individuals, and if you're more related to one another, then that it makes it so that the females are doing better in this case by helping mom than they would be if they went off on their own. The question is asking for clarification here. So what we want to do is essentially look a little bit more at sort of this dotted line here, which would say that worker sons are the same, have the same relatedness as queen sons. And what we're looking at here is, as this number gets bigger, that we're seeing that there's a greater relatedness, or differences, I should say, in relatedness between the worker sons and the queen sons. Okay, so if workers start to produce a lot of males, then what we're going to find is that the males that are out there are going to be less related. And so what we're seeing here is as we increase this difference between the relatedness of worker sons and queen sons, we're also seeing that we have more workers actually producing sons, right? So it makes sense, because if you look at it, if you said, okay, well, if all of the sons that are out there are actually queen sons, then there's a 0% of queen sons, and obviously there's a 0% of worker sons, and obviously there's that difference is also 0. So we're not making any worker sons, and there's no average difference between workers and queen sons because we're not making any. Once we start making some more of these worker sons, as is happening up here as we go up on the y-axis, we're also seeing that the relatedness between the two is increasing. So the more of these females start having their own sons, the workers start having their own sons, now we're seeing that we're getting more, different genetic combinations in there, that relatedness is going down. So if workers make more of their own sons, then the relatedness of the hive drops. And so that's one of the big issues that we see, is that the degree of relatedness in that hive can start to drastically decrease, and the differences between them, in this case, increase if workers start producing their own sons. Now we have a few general questions that didn't really go back and ask about specific figures or slides. This one, in lifetime monogamy, how is it that species does not go extinct if the colony as a whole dies after the queen runs out of sperm, or when she dies, since the workers are not reproductive? I think the key there would be essentially possibly lifetime monogamy. So if the queen is no longer producing, or obviously if the queen dies, or if the queen is no longer producing offspring, then you would have another individual that would become the queen. So just because we do have sterile workers does not necessarily mean that every one of those individuals must be sterile. So they can sometimes turn on that reproductive capacity, or they can start producing reproductive individuals after a queen dies. So yes, if you had very strict monogamy and a single queen, and nobody could take over, this would probably be obviously an issue that would occur. But there typically is someone, another individual, a worker, that can become that individual. So this question says, I understand the idea of policing and social conflict, but I'm confused about how or why the workers would be reproducing. This kind of goes back to the previous slide, the previous question. So just because we say that eusocial species have sterile casts doesn't mean that every of one of those other individuals must be sterile. So it means that there are a few reproductives, and in many cases maybe at one time only one individual is reproducing. But it doesn't mean that sometimes those individuals cannot necessarily become reproductive should that opportunity arise. So part of the policing is essentially to keep the individuals who are sort of, I guess you could say, striving to become the reproductive individual, keep that down a little bit, so that there's not as much genetic variation brought in. So obviously, as we saw a few minutes ago, if you have more individuals reproducing, then there's a lower degree of relatedness among the hive, and so this policing helps to prevent that a little bit. And so the workers can, and they often do, a lot of times workers will produce, they're not fertilized, so a lot of times they'll produce sons. They typically don't produce daughters. And in a lot of ways what happens is the female, the queen, will often tolerate some of that. And that's pretty normal for some of those unfertilized eggs that are being produced as sons to be from the sterile workers. Or I guess I shouldn't call them sterile, but the workers that typically can produce these haploid eggs that are not fertilized. I understand how inclusive fitness is maintained, but the concept of kin selection and group selection are confusing. So the biggest difference here is kin selection, you're actually doing something that is helping individuals that are related to you, getting related genes into the next generation. So you help an aunt, a grandparent, a grandchild, whatever, they share a certain fraction of your genes. And so by you helping them survive and possibly reproduce, then you're getting some aspect of your own genetic makeup into the next generation because you share those genes. Group selection is a little bit different because group selection is trying to say that you would essentially have, let's just say, these altruistic units of unrelated individuals, at least they could be unrelated, these unrelated individuals, but because we all are cooperating with one another, we as a group do better than other competing groups, and therefore by cooperating in this group we leave more genes compared to the other groups. The only issue with that is that if there's infighting that happens within the group, so now all of a sudden members inside the one group, some are leaving more than others because some are being, say, a little more altruistic than others, then it kind of breaks down. But if everybody in the group is doing the same thing and that group as a whole does better than other groups and is leaving more genes, and therefore every individual in the group is also leaving more genes, then group selection could exist. The requirements to get group selection are pretty stringent because, again, you can't have any conflict that says that individuals within the group, if they aren't quite as altruistic, could maybe do a little bit better. That can't happen because then it breaks down and now it's just a matter of individuals that are behaving selfishly are likely to do better than those that are altruistic. So it kind of has to be where individuals within the group are not really countering and doing anything different than other individuals of the group. But if those conditions arise, then yes, you could get some element of group selection. But again, the biggest difference is that with kin selection, you're really working, you still might be in groups, but the individuals that you're behaving altruistically towards, that you're helping, are individuals that are related to you. And in group selection, that's not necessarily true. If haplodiploidy leads to eusociality, would the altruists be the sterile members of the population? Yes, so the idea there is that individuals that are sterile have given up their chance to reproduce, and so at least initially when this was first discovered, they said that those sterile members were behaving altruistically. Now we know with some of these cases that that's not necessarily truly altruistic, because remember, actually those workers, since they're 3/4 related to all of those females that are being produced by their mother, they're actually increasing their own fitness, right? They're increasing their genetic contribution by being sterile and helping mom raise their sisters. So we might call it quote unquote altruism, but technically they are not decreasing their fitness. They're probably actually increasing their fitness by helping mom raise sisters. Is relatedness essential to eusociality? Yes, in most cases it is. So even when you don't have haplodiploidy, which obviously haplodiploidy does increase that relatedness, but even in those organisms where you don't have haplodiploidy, like naked mole rats, they're very inbred, and so the population inside of one of those colonies of naked mole rats, they have a very high relatedness to one another. And so it's kind of similar. It's for a different reason. They're not haplodiploid, they're truly diploid, but because of the ecological circumstances of the way their colonies are structured, they're highly inbred, and that inbreeding does increase relatedness. So in most cases, this social behavior does rely quite a bit on relatedness. Although there are other cases that we'll see where you could get social behavior, although probably not eusocial, but social behavior where individuals are reciprocating with one another. So, I'll help you today, you help me next time, that kind of thing. That's reciprocity. And reciprocity obviously can lead to a pretty good social structure, but usually in that case it's not really eusocial, where you actually have caste systems and that sort of thing.